At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Gas mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm gonna cook a meal that's gonna make you mine. We're turning up the oven, now we're ready to roast. When you touch me, honey, you'll love it the most. Come on and put me in your loving stew.
Welcome to another Bitflix.com podcast. My name's Stuart Wright, and today's guest is Simon van der Borgh, a veteran screenwriter, educator, and script consultant with a 30-year career spanning multiple continents. His work on 2008's In Transit attracted acclaim from its stars, John Malkovich and Vera Farmiga. Script consulting portfolio includes films such as the visceral London gangster thriller Kidulthood, the 1970s period drama about the birth of modern surfing industry Drift, and the near-dystopian sci-fi Tale of Redemption, These Final Hours. Simon has now condensed much of that experience and expertise into his 2024 book, Scene Writing for Film and TV, which we will discuss for the first half of this show and then move seamlessly into 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Thank you, Stuart, and it's great to be here. I'm excited to be taking part.
Indeed, indeed. Now, does that all sound like what you've signed up to do?
Yes, no shocks there yet. Yeah, it'll only be a shock if you suddenly pull out 3 films I didn't suggest, but I suspect you won't do that. So,
I wouldn't do that to myself.
I'm confident at the moment, so thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, look, before we get into details about it, do you want to give a brief synopsis as to what the book Scene Writing for Film and TV is about? If it's not obvious from the title, but you know.
It sort of does what it says on the tin, in that it is an exploration and examination of the process of writing scenes for film and television. And like you, I've spent time in Los Angeles and I've been to Barnes & Noble. And if you go into Barnes & Noble, at the time I was living in LA, there were sort of 3 or 4 shelves of screenwriting books, but very little on scene writing. And the thing about scene writing is that it's, if you like, it's the kind of engine of almost every script of any length that any of us will ever write, because it's a way of breaking down your sort of large screenplay into component parts. They're like cogs in a way in the back of a watch or a clock. So I was taught or introduced to scene writing as a process, as an aspect of writing for the screen. And I always thought it was a really neat kind of way of being able to examine what I was writing, what other people were writing when I became a script consultant, in a sort of micro way. Remembering, of course, that scenes are linked by a series of kind of common elements, such as the dramatic question of the scene and who's in the scene and where it's set and so on. So that's really kind of where the book came from and the sort of purpose of it, I guess.
And who would you say the book's aimed at?
Well, as a salesperson, I'd like to say it's aimed at, like my students sometimes do, everyone from children aged 8 to 80, and but actually in reality, it's kind of really aimed at people who are either practicing screenwriters or studying screenwriting, or maybe they're directors or actors or producers or script editors or script developers who have to work with screenwriters. I guess what makes the book unique from most screenwriting books is it doesn't contain any examples from made films, or there are barely any at all. And we'll probably talk about this, but whilst I was kind of developing the book and thinking about the book, I began to realize that one of the challenges about writing any book about writing is if you start quoting loads of example scenes, and I've got lots of scenes that are my favorite kind of scenes, they've all been produced and kind of made, and there's a number of kind of intersections in between the writer of the scene and then, if you like, the production of it, the actors, the director, the editing, and the post-production, and so on.
Yeah.
So I guess I really wanted to go back to the basics of writing. The writer is so really anyone who's interested in writing, anybody who's engaged in writing in any way, that's kind of where the book's aimed at.
Indeed, and for me, as someone who has sort of consumed many a screenwriting book, that element of you sort of lending your writing to the examples rather than sort of searching out an example to illustrate your point is not something I've seen that often. The only book that I've read that I've not read all the books, but the books I've read was Devon Watson's horror screenwriting book, where he literally writes a horror feature throughout the book, to take you through what he thinks as being a horror screenplay, a very niche thing. And equally, I particularly, the way that you give us that first person voice for starters in the book, which I think is a really interesting choice because, without making you blush too much, it's a bit like you're having a conversation with us where we don't get to answer back necessarily, but it felt like instruction and suggestion, which is a very positive way to be trying to understand screenwriting.
Yeah, and I was quite influenced once I got into the swing of it, and I began to realize I was onto something, and that the approach I'd elected to pursue was going to work. And it wasn't clear to me at the beginning that the university I was working at the time, University of York, gave me 6 months, what they called scholarship leave, to write the book.
Right.
And I did what all screenwriters do, which I used the first month to write my own screenplay, because how often do you get paid and free time to write? So, and then after about a month and a half, I suddenly thought, blimey, I'd better actually see if I can write this wretched scene writing book, or else the university's going to kind of come after me for the money. So, it really came down to a fundamental time, which is kind of reflected in the book, where I sat in a library in a part of the university called King's Manor, and I thought, can I actually write this? And I sat down, and almost like we're going to do later with the films, I sort of put a clock on, and I thought, I'm going to give myself 2 hours, and I'm going to start writing a chapter, and I'm going to see how I get on. And that's, I think, where the first person came from, because the one thing I think that's become evident the more I've been a screenwriter, but also the more I've taught and worked with other writers and other filmmakers, is the ability to kind of put yourself into the work and actually not be shy or afraid of that, and realize that not everybody's had to have meteoric life experiences or challenging situations, but if you can tell a story and if you've got an interesting take on that, then in many respects your story will become interesting to other people. I guess that's what I hope the book says to people, which is, I'm prepared to lay myself out in the open a little bit here. And the great thing, of course, about writing your own scenes is if they're written by Aaron Sorkin or William Goldman, you're sort of anxious about being rude about them because they're such great screenwriters. Whereas if they're written by me, Simon van der Borgh, it's very easy to be rude about them because, I'm not proprietorial in a way about that. And so that's kind of another reason for taking that approach. And then structuring the book, as I did, really like a software like Final Draft lays out your script, scene heading, action, character, parenthesis, dialogue, and so on.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that screenwriter friends of mine have talked about a lot is the analysis of scenes, funny enough, given the subject of your book. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that, like you observe in the book, there aren't that many books around that go down to that level. There might be a kind of couple of pages dedicated to scene writing, but not chapters of it. And it begged the question then, why do you think so few books sort of, or why does the screenwriting craft of the scene, which is, like you say, the real building block, the real cog that drives a shortest film to the longest feature, why is it sort of so underrepresented in sort of those terms?
I think part of the reason is we're very blasé because we live our lives through scenes. And so this was the one bit of philosophy, I suppose, that I encountered in the book as I thought about it, which is, because you and I currently, I'm interior office day, your interior, your home day. You know, everything we do in life is framed within some kind of scene.
Okay.
And because of that, because we're so familiar with it and it's so ubiquitous and everywhere, we tend to sort of forget that actually when you write drama, when you start to think about characters and stories, you're framing them in scenes in the same way. But actually, if you start to kind of look at those and identify those and look at the key elements of them, you can really fine-tune and sculpt the drama better. And I think initially it comes from a sense of being kind of blasé about it. Let's get on to the other stuff. Let's get on to the characters. Let's get on to the dialogue. Let's get on to the action. And then almost sometimes you think, yeah, I wonder where I'm going to set this. Whereas my experience as I began to analyze it was, we're in locations, we're in settings all the time as human beings. And so are our characters. So what if we began to kind of actually specifically understand those, and how would that then, you know, influence either in a positive way or a negative way, either providing obstacles or hope or stakes or jeopardy for the characters in those situations and locations.
Now, having gone through the process of writing the book that looks in detail about scene writing, and given you have taught screenwriting for a while, and you're also a screenwriter, what were you able to learn or observe for yourself, having gone through this process, that you couldn't have appreciated before you wrote the book?
Yes, that's a good question. It reinforced to me a couple of really fundamental things, which I've tried since writing the book. I've just finished a new screenplay, a new spec, which I'm very excited about, and I think one of the reasons it kind of it rocks off the page better and it's a fast read is because the first key question that I have always been aware of, because I started life as an actor and then I became a director, but even as a writer, I didn't apply it so strictly, as what is the specific question of the scene? And when you talk to writers, and I, you know, it's been my privilege over the last 20 years to work a lot with a lot of writers right around the world. They have a sense of what the sort of tension in the scene is or what's going on in the scene. But when you get them to think that instead of it always being, you know, will he escape? Will she escape? Will she escape? Will she escape? If in an escape sequence or a chase sequence, you can make the question specific to the particular situation that the character's in the scene, like, will she find a way out of the bathroom? Will she manage to open the window? Will she be able to climb across the fire escape? Will she be able to swing from the end of the fire escape onto the other building? They're all part of that overall tension of will she escape? Will she escape? Will she escape? Will she escape? But they're scene specific. And so that's kind of the first thing that I really felt was my biggest takeaway and that I've started to sort of reapply into my own work. The second thing, because it's the hallmark in a way of my teaching and my own writing, is it's just made it even more important to me, the value of character.
Okay.
And regardless of the genre you're writing in, regardless of the length of the script, whether you're making a 5-minute short as part of your university course or film school program, whether you're writing a horror movie, we were just talking about that earlier, whatever the genre, the style, the format you're writing in, sitcom, TV, whatever, in the end, the thing that allows us access as an audience generally is character. And if you can kind of animate those characters by giving them a clear dramatic sense in the scene, bounded within a location which doesn't always just support where they are, but maybe often challenges where they are, provides them with even more difficulty, then what that kind of does, it just, I think, helps make the writing more engaging. And certainly the response to the script I've just written has been very encouraging, in that I tried to apply in the rewrite that I did after I wrote the book many of the things that I talk about in the book, and they seem to have kind of hit home in a good way with the readers of the script. So I think the dramatic question of the scene and the characters that are in it, or character that's in it, and what they're trying to do, and the pressures that they're under, I think are the things I've learned the most. Because out of that, in one way, that can create comedy. In other ways, it can create drama, tragedy, conflict, and everything else. So I think that's how I would answer that.
Brilliant. One of the things it reminded me of was I remember an interview with Stephen Gagan, who wrote the film Syriana, and he was asked what he thought was the most important thing about writing screenplays, and he referred to Tolstoy, and Tolstoy was adamant that transition was where the best storytelling is, and obviously the way you can break down what a scene does and where it fits, like if it's a cog, it's interdependent, it's not independent. It is setting up action and stakes that then either go up or down in the next scene, and so on and so forth. And your book really sort of reminded me as a writer of that aspect of, while you're writing a scene, you've got to get the scene right in terms of how it functions, but it also has to work as to what's gone before if it's not the first scene, and what follows after. And that thing that TV and film do that no other a stage play doesn't do, which is we're allowed to jump time, aren't we, between scenes? But as long as it makes sense in terms of what's happening, that transition becomes uber important as to the success of your screenplay.
Yes, and ellipsis, as it's called, those kind of, you can either ellipse continuously from one scene to another, or you can ellipse like they do at the end of The Brutalist. You can ellipse 30 years, 20 years. And all of those are valid, and any other way you might choose to do that. But I think in the best examples of that is kind of already set up and created in the writing, rather than, you write it and then you rely on an editor or director to come up with that, because that really is fundamental within the scene to kind of how you end that scene and the possibilities of where that then might take you in the next scene, whether that's a continuous scene or it's 5 days later, it's 5 years later, it's 40 years later. And so again, I think for me, the scene writing element and the notion of the scene really helps with those kind of style elements too, and the way you get into and out of scenes.
I was happy to see you be, and obviously the cover reflects this, to be the advocate of the pen and paper as an initial part of any process in creative thinking, as far as a screenplay and a story might go. And I've only taught for 1 year. I did concept and story development for 1 year at Liverpool Media Academy. And one of the toughest parts of the job I found was getting students to accept that there's something magical that can happen away from technology. What do you think is a good argument that can be put forward as to why you believe sort of pen and paper is a good part? Because obviously we still go on writing software that formats the script for us in the end at some point. But why is pen and paper so integral, or can be integral to a writing process for you?
And it's an interesting paradox, that, because absolutely at the end of the process, if it doesn't look like a film script, if it's not formatted correctly, if it looks a mess, if you haven't used software, if you haven't, if you've made the action lines too long, if you're writing stuff which makes the reader ask, how do we know? How do we know? How do we know? So in that respect, this is what your question really prompts me to say is, writing a script or a screenplay is like writing a really long haiku with the Japanese poem, because you're setting up so much information, and yet you're trying to do it with the greatest clarity in a sort of gossamer thin way that you possibly can. And one of the ways I try and do that, so like if I'm taking a class and we're doing an in-class exercise, which is always fun, that's when I encourage people. I say, don't worry about your computer. Don't worry about typing this out. Here's 10 bits of paper. Here's 10 pens or pencils. Here's the exercise I'm going to give you. You've got to write a one-page scene, and this is the parameters: either open conflict, i.e. everybody knows what's going on, or it's hidden conflict, or you can't use any dialogue, or somebody's trying to get somebody else to do something that they don't want to do, or whatever. I say, write that down. I'm going to give you 15 minutes, and I'm going to literally start the clock, and off you go. And it doesn't matter what it looks like, because I'm not going to see that. You're just going to read it to me. But be imaginative and be challenging. And I guess the thing about writing by hand, and I still do it, this office I'm at is full of notebooks and things, is writing by hand allows you, in a sense, to be less formal and less constrained and less kind of anxious about how things look. And the trouble with screenwriting is it is so format and layout driven when it comes to it, that very often, if you start, but on the very first page of your script, staring at the blank screen of a computer. You lose some of that playfulness that's really, really important. There's an apocryphal story about the football manager Brian Clough, who remains a hero of mine. I'm a man of a certain age. And Brian Clough did a remarkable thing, which you know, I'm sure. He took Nottingham Forest to 2 European Cup, as it was called then, wins. And it is reputed that Brian Clough used to start every match by walking into the changing room, and he'd pick up a football and he'd look at all these footballers sitting in front of him. Remember, of course, that since then we've had Jose Mourinho with sort of 100-page dossiers on each player. And Brian Clough would just pick up the football and he'd look at Archie Gemmill or he'd look at Trevor Francis and he'd go, listen up, lads, this is a football. Now go out and play with it. And then he'd walk out because he knew these were great players. He knew they were as fit in their lives as they were ever going to be. So what Brian Clough did was he reintroduced the notion of the play. And I guess if you're writing by hand and if you're not being encumbered by technology at that beginning stage, it's giving you a greater potential for play.
Now, I'm not sure if you'll give us an answer to this, because you don't give us an answer. This is in the book. In the final chapter, you talk about being asked, where do your ideas come from? And then you don't answer. You say, and then I get past that, and then we move on. But you don't actually tell us in your book, where do ideas come from? So can you share with the screenwriter listeners to this podcast what your answer is in terms of where do your ideas come from when you're at that dinner party situation?
Yeah. So most of the ideas that I've written about and then turned into spec scripts, of which most of the scripts I've written have been spec. I've been very lucky because I've sort of sold most of them. But they usually come from something I've overheard. So, for example, my father was a great expert and scholar and had a lot of interest in Napoleon Bonaparte. And he used to tell me this story about when Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to St. Helena, and was at the time the scariest, most dangerous man on the planet. Sounds familiar. When he arrived in St. Helena, they weren't expecting him, and he was billeted in the pavilion of the governor's house or the assistant governor's house. And that's where he met a young girl called Betsy Balcombe. And they became, he was befriended by her and she became his interlocutor and everything else. So that's a personal thing that my dad told me. And then 5 years later, I don't know, I was thinking of an idea and it sort of popped into the back of my head. The movie I've just written is formed of several things that I'm interested in. One of them is football, and the other is I did a trip to Senegal with my brother. We did a walking trip through Senegal, a very sort of basic trek through Senegal together a few years ago. And out of that, we met some characters and a story presented itself. In the book, I reference a film called Blood Oath, which is an Australian kind of horror thriller I wrote. And that literally came about because I was sitting on a bus after a workshop up in the hills outside Melbourne, talking to a very good New Zealand screenwriter. And he said to me, what are you doing after this workshop, when you get to Melbourne Airport? And I said, being a sort of stupid Pom Englishman, I said, oh, well, I'm catching a plane to Perth and I'm hiring a little rental car and I'm driving 500 miles into the Australian outback to meet my brother who's doing a trip around Australia and he's in the middle of nowhere near the Pilbara. And this he just looked at me like I was completely crazy. And he sort of said, well, what happens if you go all the way and he's not there? And so that notion of going all the way to somewhere remote, and when you get there, the person you arranged to meet isn't there, became the basis. So I suppose for me over the years, in answer to where do my ideas come from, I initially was very anxious as a new writer about my ideas being too close to me, because I thought, how can someone like me have any stories that anyone else is going to be interested in? I had a pretty happy childhood. I've had a pretty happy adulthood. Things have happened to me, but I've been very fortunate. So kind of, where's the drama? And then I realized, well, actually the dramas and the characters that I found and the situations I put them in and my own particular take on that and the way that I've housed them in scenes or whatever and kind of unleashed them. And so I guess for me, the more personal now an idea is in terms of my interest in it, then generally the better.
I must admit, I don't know if you've read the book Difficult Men about the sort of peak TV period, but I was really shocked at how much of the brilliant scenes and episodes were directly taken from the writers' lives. Like there was like beat for beat, but they just thought that's what's going to make this authentic.
When I was at the National Film School and I did screenwriting back in the 90s, it was a very important time for me because I'd been a director before that, and I'd been a pretty successful corporate video director, commercials director. I'd gone all around the world and had a lot of fun making kind of glossy films. And then I tried to turn the juggernaut around and went to film school and had this extraordinary screenwriting teacher called Jan Fleischer. And anybody who's been at the film school remember Jan Fleischer. And Jan Fleischer used to sit there in this sort of funny little Nissen hut that we were all crammed into. And he had these amazing sort of Czech beard down here, and he used to hold a pipe and smoke this pipe. And Jan was not impressed by anything, and Hollywood movies or whatever, and he would just stare at you when you were sort of stumbling your way through your new idea. And what you realized about Jan fairly early on is that he had to flee what was then Czechoslovakia in 1968 with his young family and leave everything behind. So he'd already gone through a massive change, which most of us could never even imagine. He'd lost his homeland. He'd lost everything that connected him there. And so, a bunch of screenwriters writing their sort of, self-referential, solipsistic stuff. He'd heard it all before, but he had these great aphorisms. He'd say things like, if you sort of talk to him about something, he'd look at you and he'd go, "The man with the fire at his back jumps the widest river." And that's all he'd say. He wouldn't kind of give you any more than that. That was the note. And then if you came in and you sort of were rather pleased with your scene or whatever you'd written for him, and you were sort of slightly showing off about it, Jan would look at you and he'd take a puff on the pipe and he'd go, "The stag with the biggest antlers gets caught in the forest when the hunters come." And that was it. That was the note. So you had to sort of decipher your way through this kind of Eastern European pedagogy. But actually, that was kind of a really great lesson to learn, because at the end of it, I said to him, "Oh, Jan, and I was 33. I had kids. I'd had a pretty successful career, and I'd given up quite a lot." And I did that classic thing at my final meeting with Jan. I went, "Jan, I can't make up my mind whether I want to write comedy or drama and tragedy." Kind of looking back, it was such a sort of bonkersly naive thing to say. And Jan looked at me and he went, "The donkey that walks in the middle of the road starves to death because the grass is on either side." And I guess that was the beginning of me thinking, there's more to this lark than meets the eye. And actually, where do I sit in that? And he said, it will take you 10 years before you find success as a screenwriter. And when you're 33, you think, "Oh my God, I'm going to be 43. That actually was wrong. It took 9 years, 8 months by the time In Transit came out. So, he was but what he kind of, I guess, did was he was constantly shaking you up to go back into yourself and draw on your own ideas and your own feelings and your own situation and put yourself in a scene, in the shoes of your character and everything else. And I, funnily enough, carried that with me, that coupled with all of the techniques and skills and tools, which are really important, want and need and the key beats and structure and act structure and sequences and everything else. But coupled with that, if you can then dig a little bit into yourself as well, put a little bit of yourself in the work, then I think you really start to get somewhere with it.
Now, I think you may, by what you've led on to there, you may already begun to answer this question, but I think given you've taught undergraduates who would have come to you as first year, maybe straight from A-levels and the like, and you've got a book now which is for people that, like me, that have an idea of what a screenplay is, but it certainly does no harm to confirm what you understand or find another angle to what you don't quite understand. I mean, that was what I got from reading. There was things that I was going, "Oh my God, that's bleeding obvious," but I hadn't thought of it that way. So what, to your mind, makes a good screenwriting student? I
think, in my experience, the people who think they're great writers when they arrive from their school or whatever, they tend not to be great writers. What I always loved about teaching at the university was you saw people who were with you for 3 years. And very often, everybody in a way had to write a script because they all had to make a short film. And it was during that process that some students who were often female, often quiet, not sort of alpha male people at all, but they found in the writing a little glimpse of something, a little kind of light went on, and they began to realize that by writing they could be funny, or they could be deadly serious, or they could be heard, or they could move people. And so I don't think there's a simple answer to what makes someone a screenwriter. I think you've got to be talented, of course, but I think you can learn a lot of the key elements of writing. For me, if I look at my own career and the career of people I know, the most important thing really is resilience, especially if you're a British screenwriter, because you can have all the talent in the world. And at film school, there were much more talented screenwriters than me at the National. But, they got sidetracked, or they got frustrated with the lack of progress, or they got bored and they go off and they do other things. And actually being resilient and sticking to it and working hard to get better. So in some respects, the reason why I think the book's personal and, has been, welcomed as such is because, and in fact, a friend of mine who used to be a book editor said when we were trying to work out the title of the book that you referred to, the cover of the book, she reminded me that in the 1960s, there were a series of what were called writers' notebooks. Quite famous kind of writers would write writers' notebooks. They were published in the 50s and 60s, and they had the same kind of black and white cover that my book's got. And she said, in a way, your book's kind of like a writer's notebook, because you're putting on the table not just a theory or an approach, but also a kind of how you've survived or enjoyed. And I have enjoyed it. I joke with people. I've been very blessed. I've got 3 fantastic children. My wife and I have been very blessed, and my children are pretty successful. And I say to people, one of the great things about having motivated, successful children is to have been a fairly unsuccessful screenwriter. I think if I'd been a massively successful Hollywood screenwriter too early, they would have had every excuse in the world not to go out and make their own way. And luckily, they've seen me work really hard all their lives for sort of some reward and everything else. But it's meant that they've realized, actually, you've got to make your own way in this. And I think resilience, if you can manage it, and it's difficult, but I think that sense in which you get pleasure from writing. The reality for me is I've written 22 screenplays. 3 of them have gone into production. But I've loved writing every script. And in some respects, I get pleasure, and I get, I guess, a number of things from just the sheer process of writing a film script. And one of my great screenwriting teachers from America said, the wonderful thing about the first draft that you write as a writer is you're the first person to see the film in your head. And there's a lot to be said for that. You know what it's like. You sit down and you're going to write a horror scene, and you were just telling me about writing in a Finnish forest or whatever. Yeah. And that you see that movie, it's in your head. That scene, whatever it is, you see that, you live it, you smell it. And, that's a privilege, really. I mean, most people have such boring jobs. So you're privileged if you're able to do that and play in the Brian Clough sense and use your imagination. My wife and I used to go to dinner parties, and we'd sort of sit there surrounded by lots of extremely successful people. And sometimes, the conversation would turn to, what do you do? And my wife used to say, the one thing you have to remember about Simon, and I have to say she's my biggest critic, she would say that everything we have in our house and our lives has come out of Simon's head. And, that's a nice way to be remembered by someone. That, your creativity, or such as it is, or your ability to imagine characters and situations and put them in scenes and get them up on their feet and move around and hopefully connect with people, make people cry, make people laugh, make people angry. You're privileged if you're able to have that opportunity. And that's what screenwriting's given me.
Brilliant. And I think sort of reading between the lines there, the idea of what makes a good screenwriting student is, along with that resilience, is it's okay to not know what you're doing at the start, but be willing to keep getting better. I mean, it sounds very simple, but
I think the thing too is, if I look back at the people who've, I was very lucky in my first year at York, because I arrived at York from Australia and was teaching screenwriting. And in the first year, a very quiet, very sort of self-possessed young woman student wrote a TV pilot, which I was the developer and helped her with and taught her with. And you could just see her blossoming as a writer, as a person, because she'd sort of found what she wanted to do. And that screenplay that she wrote won the Peter Ustinov Emmys Screenwriting Prize in 2013, in the autumn of 2013. And she went to America and it launched her career.
Amazing.
And that was wonderful for her. And of course, it was very encouraging for me, because I suddenly realized, actually, I'd been a bit sniffy before I went to York, because I'd only taught, professional writers and older writers and master's writers.
Yeah.
And I thought, how can you teach undergraduates to write? But then I soon realized, no, the great thing about teaching undergraduates is they've got no fear. They don't sit there like a 35-year-old like I was at film school, overanalyzing everything and thinking, oh my gosh, I've got two small daughters. How am I going to? They just sit down and write something. And if you don't like it, they go in. Very often they come back and they write something new, or they write something different, or they rewrite it. And I have to say that was one of the greatest things about my 12 years at York, was seeing so many people step up to the plate and enjoy and discover an enjoyment of writing. So yes, down the line, of course, for somebody like me or you, when you are a professional writer, I think resilience is really important. But also not being scared, playing, not always taking everything at, obviously people like me always have an answer or a question, but sometimes you have to ignore that and just back yourself. And if you feel what you're writing is right and it's working for you, then great, do it. Go for it.
Fantastic. Well, on that positive note, we shall draw a close to the conversation about scene writing for film and TV by Simon van der Borgh. Thank you for sharing all that. And we will now move on to 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Right then, for those that don't know the 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life, Simon has given me 3 titles, which we will look at, but we'll only look at them 5 minutes at a time. And every time we hear this sound, can you hear that alarm at your end?
I certainly can. I was moving towards the door, and then I realized it wasn't a real alarm. It was okay, Simon, calm down.
Indeed. So yeah, every 5 minutes that alarm will go off. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Simon's first choice is the 19th animated feature in the Disney canon and the last to be supervised by Walt Disney himself. It was released after his death in '66 and dedicated to his memory. It's the story of a panther and a bear who have a difficult time trying to convince a boy to leave the jungle for human civilization, which when I read that, I was like, that's great high concept. And to mind. I'm indeed talking about 1967's Jungle Book, or as Simon refers to it, his childhood years. So tell us, Simon, how does this film end up having impact on you and lasting memories?
Yeah, so I was brought up for the second half of the 60s in Australia.
Okay.
And I spent quite a lot of formative years, 7, 8, 9 in Australia. And having come from the UK, Australia for me as a memory is colours and bright lights and outdoor living and, larking about with my cousins and my brothers in the sunshine and swimming and the beach and everything else. Of course, we went to school, but one remembers those sort of the atmosphere and the feeling of it. And I saw Jungle Book when I was living in Australia. Now, I'm uncertain how I saw it. Did I see it in a cinema? I like to think, and that it hasn't been told that this is wrong, that we went to see it in a drive-in.
Okay.
We were and we were so Mum and Dad. I had 3 brothers, so there were 4 of us, and then they had a big station wagon. And in those days, you'd arrive at a drive-in, which is like an open air, massive screen cinema, and you get 2 speakers as you arrived, or 1 speaker, and you'd park up, and that is my memory of seeing the Jungle Book. And so the colors of the film, the musicality of it, the songs, the character work. Again, for me, it comes back to character. It's all embodied in a way in that memory of the life I was living at the time in Australia, and the sense in which childhood is a very temporary and short part of your life, that innocence of childhood. And at the age of 7 or 8, I could not understand why Mowgli went to the village when he could have stayed with Baloo, because Baloo was kind of everything I was searching for in my life. Baloo was funny, Baloo was a buddy, Baloo was witty, Baloo was funny, Baloo could sing, and of course Baloo's a bear. So there was a kind of perfect element of friendship in that. Now, of course, now I'm an adult, I fully understand why Mowgli goes to the man village, as they call it, and because he sees and meets, a girl, a woman, and the rest potentially for him is history. And for me, the film sort of, in a sense, represents that journey you make from your childhood and your imagination and an innocence, in a way, to the realization that in the end, life is more complicated, there's more to it. And for me, the Jungle Book embodies a kind of sense of innocence, not just in the film itself, but also in my life and my world at the time. I'm aware too, as you said in the introduction, that it was Walt Disney's last movie. It has a kind of 60s vibe to it, with the vultures who are kind of the Beatles. I think Phil Harris is brilliant as Baloo. I think, is it Sterling Holloway is fantastic.
It's funny you mention that. The Beatles were originally in the development. I mean, they were talking to Epstein about how they were going to do it, and they couldn't make it, and that changed it into the Barbershop Quartet in the end. Yeah.
So, I mean, they've got the mop-haired vulture, so there's enough kind of coding for you to, to sense, And we loved, my brothers and I, so there were 4 of us and 4 of the vultures, and we knew the dialogue off by heart, let's do something, in that kind of Liverpool tone. And so, it became totemic, really, for us. And I think it's a sense and a memory of an ideal time or period, a moment you don't really ever get back, but you're very lucky if you've ever experienced it and sensed it. Cinema Paradiso kind of riffs on it in a way from the child's point of view, and it explores that sense of innocence and becoming aware of complications around it. For me, the Jungle Book has a joyful element to it, and I'm aware of the.
There's our first alarm. Do you want to finish that thought?
Yeah, I'm aware, of course, that it was made in the 60s, and there's the anthropomorphic thing of animals and the kind of element of the Indian village and the whole complication around that. But at the time, at the age of 7, look for the Bear Necessities still makes me smile today if I hear it.
Just to add, and it's interesting with the advent of AI, and I'm talking to you on a video call, I've blurred my background and stuff while we're talking without me fiddling with a camera. It just does it and keeps me in focus. For the film's backgrounds in Jungle Book, the animators went to real jungles of India and studied wildlife. It was like there wasn't an add-on that could do, and obviously it's hand drawn as well.
Yeah, I mean, just one final thing. I know we wrote the budget for the Jungle Book is reputed to be $4 million, and it's taken almost 400 million at the box office.
Right,
and it's almost impossible to imagine a movie today taking 100 times its budget at the box office alone. Yeah. It would mean that one of the Marvel films would have to take billions of dollars to recoup at that kind of 1 to 100 level. So clearly, the film at the time touched a big chord with people and was a phenomenal success. And so I'm not too crazy about box office, but I like to bear it in mind. And the fact that you can make something for $4 million and an animation, I mean, goodness knows what it would cost today to make an animation of that level. As you say, if you're sending scenic artists and people to India and it's all hand drawn, but the fact that it cost $4 million and it took 378 million, I think, is it stands the test of time from that point of view for me.
Weirdly, not weird, I suppose, but you and I are 10 years difference in age, and I saw Jungle Book in 1977 or 78 at the ABC cinema in Manchester, so it still was getting a run for my childhood as well. It's one of my early cinema memories.
Yes, and I think, it was always being re-released in the holidays. And I'm sure that, so in 1977, did you say?
I think I saw it in 77, and then 67 it came out.
I was a chippy 16-year-old at grammar school in Sussex, and I probably went to see the Jungle Book still, despite that, because I just loved the movie.
Brilliant. Right then, for your second choice, Paul Brickell, who wrote the book on which this movie was based, was piloting a Spitfire aircraft that was shot down over Tunisia in March 1993. He was taken to Stalag Luft 3 in Poland, where he assisted in escape preparations. A big influence on this film. The ensemble cast is mouthwatering when you list it. Steve McQueen, James Garner, Dickie Attenborough, Charles Bronson, Donald Pleasance, James Coburn, Gordon Jackson, a young David McCallum, and a pop singer turned actor John Layton in the story about Allied officers in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II making a daring escape plan. I am indeed talking about 1963's The Great Escape, or as Simon describes it, his teenage years. So tell us, where does this fit in?
Yeah, so we came back from Australia in the late 60s, and my parents are farmers, but the farming comes from my mother's side.
Right.
And so she had a farm in Sussex, and we lived in Sussex. And my parents had 4 sons in 4 years. I'm the eldest. And then I've got a brother, Matthew, who was born in 1971. So he was about 10, 11 years younger than me. And, we lived on a farm in those days. Sussex was, quite remote. It wasn't nearly as connected as it is today. We didn't have cars. We just had bicycles. And I think we must have driven my parents mad, because what would happen every now and then is, they'd stop the beaten up old Volvo they had. That she'd open the boot, my mum, and she'd corral the 4 of us, me, my brother Peter, James and Adam, stick us in the back of the Volvo and drive us down to Horsham, which was a market town where we lived. And she'd stop outside the ABC and she'd give us, 50p each. I think it was all it was to get in. And on the screen was a double bill. And the double bills we absolutely loved the double bills. And some of them are now considered kind of retro of their time, but things like, Where Eagles Dare and The Great Escape, or Guns of the Navarone and Force 10 from Navarone, or Goldfinger and From Russia with Love. So we'd wander into the ABC and we'd sit down and we'd watch these kind of iconic, as they felt to us, movies that reinforced the supremacy of the British Empire. And it was comfortable, and it was action packed, and it was reinforcing of everything that we'd been educated and led to believe about Britain, and particularly England and Englishness and everything else. And I'm aware of that now in retrospect, but actually at the time they were just great stories. And we'd then go home and we'd act them out, so we'd act out The Great Escape. We'd, dig tunnels in the woods that we had on the farm, or we'd some of us would be Germans and some of us would be English pilots or whatever. The way you do as a kid of 13, 14, 12. Remember, of course, my brothers were younger, so I was the eldest. So they were, often in their 10s, 12s, 11s and so on. But we just got sort of completely enthralled and wrapped up in the notion of this 2 movies in an afternoon. And of course, I now realize that the reason my mum did it, and she's still alive today, the reason why she did it is because it gave her 4 or 5 hours without us. I mean, it meant that she could stick us in the car, take us down to Horsham, and we'd be in the cinema. So in a sense, it was a free childcare, and we could rampage around in the ABC doing whatever we were doing, which actually was watching the movies. And she had a breathing space of 4 or 5 hours. But that's kind of where I fell in love with cinema films and projected movies, and that sense of sitting in the dark, with your brothers or whoever, the lights going down and the movie starting in that darkness, that's become a totemic and powerful thing for me. And The Great Escape, when you read about it now, I mean, John Sturges is a great director.
Yeah.
And he ironically directed a number of films that remain favourite films of mine, things like Bad Day at Black Rock, which is still one of my most favourite movies, you know, with Spencer Tracy. Such a brilliant idea for a movie. Man gets off train, has 24 hours to sort out some really bad stuff before the train arrives and he gets on it again. I mean, it is one of the great premises for a movie. Gunfight at the...
Do you want to finish that thought?
Yeah, Gunfight at the OK Corral, The Magnificent Seven, and indeed, I think Where Eagles Dare as well. So I didn't realize it at the time, but those kind of narratives that John Sturges was directing really spoke to me at that age in terms of action, character, energy, adventure, and so on. Obviously, the film is a poetic reimagining of what actually happened. A lot of the characters are based on, but they're kind of inventions. But that didn't bother me at the time because I just, you know, we loved Steve McQueen, the Cooler King. We loved that terrifying moment when they get off the bus and James Garner's helping Donald Pleasance or whatever it is. Or I think it might be Gordon Jackson. And he says, you know, have a good day. Thank you. And then they give away the fact that they're English because the Germans have tricked them. I mean, those moments, those scenes, we're back to scenes again, but those scenes have stayed with me all my life. The kind of horror of that moment and then running down the platform, being chased by the Germans who are hunting for you. And of course, the iconic scene at the end when they get out of the truck and they hear the machine guns clicking and you realize at that moment what's going to happen to them. You know, those have become symbols for me of the power of the cinema and of scenes and of action and character.
For your final choice, this was largely written while on location filming for Raiders of the Lost Ark during filming breaks. Steven Spielberg dictated the story to screenwriter Melissa Matheson, who was with her then boyfriend and future husband Harrison Ford. When this film test screened at Cannes, as an unofficial entry, it brought the house down, receiving a standing ovation that had eluded most of the official entries. Sir Richard Attenborough later said that he felt bad that his own film Gandhi beat this film to the Best Picture at the Oscars because he considered his friend Steven Spielberg's film more deserving of the award and was convinced it would win. It is the story of a troubled child who summons the courage to help a friendly alien escape from Earth and return to his home planet. I'm indeed talking about 1982's E.T., or as Simon describes the period in his life, becoming an adult. Tell us more.
Yeah, and I think what the film symbolizes to me now is a bit like what we were talking about earlier about don't be afraid to put yourself in your stories. So in some respects, E.T. seems like a rather prosaic story of a lonely boy kind of befriending an alien and kind of he's an alien because he doesn't fit in with his brother and sister and he befriends an alien and, you know, it's all rather whimsical potentially. But of course, if you start to understand that Elliot in a way is a riff on Spielberg himself, who was an only child and, you know, he was very lonely when his parents were going through their divorce. And of course, Elliot lives with his mum. There's no father in the story. I can now see in hindsight, of course, that there's a lot of Steven Spielberg in that movie. And that perhaps for me indicates why it's such a powerful piece of work. For me, myself, I just left university. I was at Warwick University and I left in 1982. And I was a kind of proto-quasi-Marxist, typical kind of university graduate, thought I knew everything, had a beard, had red trousers, sort of, you know, used to argue the toss with everybody. And I went to live with my grandmother in London because I was trying to get into the theatre. And so I sort of ran away from the farm and went to live with my grandmother. And my grandmother was this wonderfully posh elderly woman. She was 81 when I went to live with her. And we lived in a one-bedroom flat in Earl's Court. And she gave up her bed for me and sort of put me up in the sitting room, surrounded by all these pictures and artifacts, and she'd been born in India, part of the sort of Raj in India. And so, she came, we're back to the Jungle Book. She came from this very sort of particular background. She was an only child, but she loved the theatre and she loved the movies. And that's where I got my passion for cinema and theatre from. And one day we go to watch a play. We went to the National to see On the Razzle in 1981 together, which was written by Tom Stoppard. And there was a platform performance of this play afterwards. And I remember having a big row with Tom Stoppard and kind of, it all got kind of quite heated. And my grandmother, who was, nudged me in the ribs and said, "Keep going, you've got him on the ropes," which was wonderfully supportive. Stoppard arguing with this stupid, pompous university, undergraduate who looked frankly ludicrous, But so we bonded, me and my grandmother. She was a massive influence on me. And we went to see E.T. in the ABC in the Fulham Road. And we must have looked like a very incongruous sight at the 2:00 screening in late 1982, this sort of bearded person and this very elderly, smart old lady. And in the dark, watching E.T., we both sort of connected in the story and the characters. And it moved me to tears. And I know she found it very involving and emotional too. And I remember afterwards, at that point, I was set into going into the theatre, and I had these wonderfully arrogant notions that I was going to end up, running the National Theatre or writing a better play than Tom Stoppard or whatever. But I think looking back, it was at that moment watching E.T. and thinking that anything that could unite a kind of chippy 21-year-old Marxist, quasi-Marxist, faux Marxist, and an 81-year-old woman right at the end of her life who'd been born in India and, lived all the way through the 20th century. Her life spanned the whole of the history of cinema. She had lived through the whole thing. She was old enough to remember that when she was a little girl in Chelsea, she used to ride to Fulham to get milk in the morning, and they'd go through countryside to get from Chelsea to Fulham because there was a farm at Fulham. So, she had lived a tremendous life all the way through the 20th century. Born in 1901, and she really had seen the zenith and the decline of the British Empire, 2 world wars, everything else. And the fact that we could sit there watching this kind of movie, this invention about a boy and what is basically a rubber prop, and with bad, as it looks now, special effects with them cycling, but you forget all of that because in the moment when they're riding their bikes, escaping from Keys and the others, you want them to fly and you don't care that it looks like rather dodgy special effects now. And of course, today they do it so much better. You don't care because you're invested in the story. You're invested in the characters. You are invested in Elliot. You love Elliot. You love E.T. You even like Mikey, the brother, by the end, and Drew Barrymore, the girl. You want them to escape. You want them to win. You want them to return E.T. to his spaceship so that he can go home. And I think that any medium that can do that, and in the process move a quasi-Marxist and an 81-year-old posh-bird who's basically seen it all, that is the magic of cinema.
Well, I was going to say I couldn't put it better, but I'm so glad you told that story. That's fantastic. And that brings us to the end of 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Thank you very much for sharing those stories. Thank you very much for talking us through Scene Writing for Film and TV, your book, which is available now. And it just gives me to say thank you very much for giving your time on the Britflix podcast.
Thanks, Stuart. It's been great. And what could be better than talking about film?
Hey there, Hugh from Podderation here. If you like today's show, then we think you will love Punch and Roll for Initiative, the other D&D show by a bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors. Join a brand new show from the ground up with a cast full of professional voice talent as they make their own adventures in a custom-made fantasy world. If you want to hear more, check out our website at podderation.com.